Even a brisk 10-minute one. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. The topic of today's webinar is when leaders truly listen. People step up, and I'll quickly introduce myself as your host so you know who I am before I turn over the mic to my dear friend Shed. So my name is Sanja Licina. I am an organizational psychologist. I'm the president of Question Pro Workforce team. I currently reside in gorgeous sunny Buenos Aires, Argentina. I can say that today because shockingly, we've had like a week of rain leading up to this. I have lived on 3 continents in my life between Europe, North America, and now South America, and really dedicated my career to finding ways to effectively connect with people and really find ways to help people find fulfillment in their work, to find happiness in what they do. I'm a true believer that we all deserve really good things in our careers. And I believe that it should be much more than a paycheck. It's something that impacts not only our working hours, but it of course impacts any time that we spend outside of that with our family, with our friends, and our hobbies. Everything is related to each other. And so throughout this journey of focusing on different things that are important and really have a significant impact on the workplace, the concept of psychological safety has come up a lot. And I think it's come up a lot lately, especially because it's something that we just didn't talk about as much. And maybe we took for granted before. I don't know what it was, but it just makes me so happy that this topic is so important and that it's really gaining ground and that we're hearing from more and more individuals, leaders, managers, organizations that are saying, what is this? When I think about psychological safety, when I think about creating a speak up culture, what does that mean? How do I do it? How do I know if I'm doing it, even if I have the best intentions? And so I had this incredible pleasure of meeting Shed, or Stephen Shedletzky is his full name, in the last couple of years, and just really bonding with him around everything that he is, everything that he stands for, the difference that he's trying to make in the world, and the difference that he is making in the world. And so I don't know, Shed, how many times you and I have spoken by now, but we thought it's just a really important moment for us to open up this conversation. I feel um, just so privileged to have learned so much from my conversations with Shed over time. And I've noticed how much that's impacted the way that I think, the way that I run my business, the way that I influence our culture at Question Pro. And it's just an incredible pleasure, Shed, to have you here today and to be able to share with all of our friends, colleagues, our audience, just, all the brilliance and all the knowledge you have. So before we jump in, all into all of the content and all of the practical advice and all of the theory, I would love for you to introduce yourself and tell our friends on the call a little bit about who you are and what makes you passionate about work that you do.
Thank you so much, Sonia. It's such a delight to be here with you and everyone who's joining us. And I have to give a hat tip to our common friend, our mutual friend, Pat Laverne, who first introduced us. So if it weren't for Pat, we wouldn't be
Yes.
here. And over the past, gosh, it's been definitely maybe 2, 3 years. I think we first met as I was writing the book. And so it's such a delight to continue our relationship, especially as the book comes out and my own thinking on the topic has developed and matured. But I think, you and I get along so well because we believe in the same vision of the world that, we work on average 90,000 hours in our lives. And I think we share in this common belief that we ought to derive enjoyment and fulfillment and meaning from those hours, from those thousands of hours. And we don't have to like every moment to feel fulfilled. Fulfillment isn't about happiness all the time. Fulfillment can actually be deriving meaning from times that are hard and challenging. So yeah, I've been doing this work for close to 15 years. Had a chance to work with Simon Sinek for the first after a few years in corporate, I joined Simon's team and worked with him for 10 years, which was brilliant. Still do a little bit of work with their team. And the majority of my practice now is really focusing on what are the behaviors of leaders that either create a speak up culture or deter from it.
Yeah.
And when we deter from a speak up culture, not only is it bad for results and innovation and safety, it's also bad for human health and well being.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for investing so much of your time and energy of who you are in this area, because I do think, like I was saying, it's something that's so incredibly important and something that I hope we continue to see more conversations like this. And I hope we continue to just really see that widespread impact. And so before we jump into all of the takeaways and talk about a lot of the concepts around Shed's book, I just wanted to mention real quick, I mentioned that I work at Question Pro. And when I started doing webinars many moons ago, and we would finish, people would tell me like, "Oh, Sanja, that was really great. But I have no idea what Question Pro does." And so I thought, as a sponsor of this webinar, it's better to spend 1 minute telling you all who we are. So Question Pro was founded in 2005. So we've been around for, I can't believe it, almost 2 decades. And we work on different kinds of research pillars. So I mentioned I'm the president of the workforce business unit. So we really specialize in employee surveys and continuous listening, just really connecting with people in all of their key points of the life cycle and making sure that they feel seen and heard, and really helping organizations understand what are the bets that they should and could be taking. What are the greatest needs? What are the greatest opportunities? And where do they really excel? What do people love about them and love about their culture that really helps them stand apart? So that's the specific business area that I lead. We also have a customer experience area, which is a really wonderful complement to employee experience surveys, because as most of us know, the more likely you are to have happy employees, the more likely you are to have happy customers. It is a very cyclical process. It is very rare that people are miserable in their jobs, but yet somehow deliver above and beyond to their customers continuously and stay in their jobs. So it's been a lot of fun to do the EX and CX research. And then we have a whole third research arm that focuses on university research, market research, really going out there and understanding whether it's a new product launch or whether it's studying the market, what's going on today, what's resonating, what's not resonating, etc. So a big part to the help of our research arm, we actually at Question Pro last year conducted a large study and asked workers across the US a little bit over 100 questions. We wanted to know everything, right? We wanted to know everything from career development to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, to well-being, learning and development. Like, I mean, you name it, we probably asked our workers that. And what we found in that large market research study was very alarming, and a big part of the reason why we're having this conversation with Shed today. So one of the findings was that under a third of workers really felt comfortable speaking up and providing their perspective during meetings, right? And so think about if you have a table of 10 people, that probably, even if everybody has something they want to say, like maybe two, maybe three on a good day are going to actually raise their hand and bring up an idea or bring up a concern. And when you scale that across the organization, and one thing that we know is that leaders don't know everything. We can't, it's too much, and managers don't. And so our employees are such a huge wealth of information and such a huge wealth of knowledge, whether it's innovation or whether it's something that's more challenging and something that's an opportunity to improve or something that could lead to a bad situation. The majority of people don't feel comfortable bringing that up, even in a setting like a meeting that's more structured to actually share ideas and have those conversations. And then even fewer of workers feel that their opinions and ideas are valued in decision making. So you think those two really concepts are complementary, because if I feel like I'm going to say something, but you're not going to do much with it, if I was already hesitant to speak up, probably the likelihood that I'm going to speak up again in the future is quite low. So these are just a couple of the statistics that really got us thinking, wow, we need to bring an expert like Shed in and have a wider conversation around it. And then just a couple of more stats, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation or conversation, is that, of course, when we look at data, I love to look at gender differences and say, sometimes they're stereotypes, sometimes they play out in data. But here we do see that there's a significant difference between females and males when it comes to their comfort of speaking up and feeling heard, where it's almost a 10 percentage point difference, where only just over a quarter of women say that they feel okay speaking up during a meeting. And then even fewer than that feel like that their opinions are valued in decision making. So when you look at that, the stark difference between 24% for women and 36% for men, you think, wow, if creating an open culture, if creating a culture where our employees feel psychological safety is important to us, it's really critical that we look at, particular opinion of everyone, but women as well, because there's something that's actually making them feel less comfortable and less valued than their male counterparts. And then the final data slide, and then I promise we'll pop out and chat with Shed, was this big difference with individual contributors and managers. And for a lot of you to do research and do employee surveys in your organization, it's probably not shocking to you that there is a difference between management level, that a lot of times when you get to executive areas, there's just different findings in surveys, different levels of comfort, different access to information, different confidence in speaking up, whether it's your tenure, whether it's your title, whatever that sense is. And so what's really important to me, and you see actually the gaps here are even bigger than between males and females, is for managers how important it is for them to actually create a space for their teams, and maybe outside of a formal meeting, maybe more in one-on-one, maybe over a coffee, to really have a conversation with their teams and ask them what's going well, what's not going well, to maybe pointedly ask, do you have some specific concerns that you would bring up, because we're seeing in this data that there's a huge difference between individual contributors and managers in both how open they are in speaking up and how valued they feel like their opinions are. I mean, if you look at the 22% compared to 39%, like it's almost double. I'll definitely continue to dig into this data because it's something that surprised me quite a bit. Not that there was a difference, but the magnitude of the difference. And if you think about that's, we're not looking at top executives, right? We're not looking at C levels. We're not looking at, just VPs or executive board. This is anybody that has management responsibility. So the gap starts to become pretty big pretty early on in the organizational hierarchy. So with all this data, Shed, my friend, it is incredible to have you here. Just looking at this made me think we need to continue to talk about this. And for those of you who might not know, we also just recorded a podcast with Shed. So we'll follow up and we'll sneak that into our webinar follow-up as well. So Shed, tell us in your definition, when we think about psychological safety, when we think about creating a speak up culture. So if an
Mhm.
organization is saying, listen, Sanja, Shad, I love that data. I'm in this webinar because I do find it important, but I'm still looking to really understand, like, what is this? What should I be looking for? What should I be building, measuring? How would you define a speak up culture?
So, well, funny you should ask. I have a slide for that, and I think will help. So, when talking about a speak up culture, I have a clear definition of it, and there's a distinction in something bigger than. Sorry, my computer's frozen. Can you see that slide? Yes, you can.
Yeah,
Um,
perfectly.
Beautiful. So a speak up culture is more than only psychological safety. So I define a speak up culture as an environment in which people feel that it is both psychologically safe, and then the key piece is worth it to share ideas, even if they're half baked, to share feedback to help one another grow. That's the purpose of feedback. It's the first four letters, FEED, feed. Feedback is not meant to knock down. Feedback is made to build up, to build relationship with self, with another, and to help one another grow, to share concerns, even if they're unpopular or personal, before they become safety, ethical performance concerns, to disagree. How does it go when you disagree with someone more senior than you in the organization? Is that dissenting actually rewarded and seen as valuable, or is it repeatedly ignored or punished? And even admit mistake, believing it will lead to improvement. So that's how I define it. And the key sort of thing in sharing that it is not only about psychological safety, it's also about, is it worth it? Sorry, Sonia, I'm having some tech issues here. Do you still see me?
I see you. I don't see a slide, but I see you.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, we'll see what happens when I try to reshare more. Um, the thing that is interesting when talking about a speak up culture is not only about psychological safety, it's also around this perception of impact. And so the thing that I think is really interesting in the survey questions you asked is there's two words that stood out for me. One word was comfort and the other word was value. Do people feel
Yeah.
that their voice is valued? My experience with the speak up culture is sometimes we speak up, but it doesn't mean that the goal should be an absence of fear. Amy Edmondson, a brilliant scholar out of Harvard who wrote the book The Fearless Organization, I had a conversation with her about it, and she admitted that fearless is an idealized notion, that I don't think the goal should be fearlessness, because if you
Mm.
truly come across a fearless leader or someone who is fearless, they're actually quite dangerous. Fear
Mm.
shouldn't be the goal, or fearlessness shouldn't be the goal. It should be to feel the fear and use it as data. And so I think the interesting question for us to measure is, do folks feel that it is actually worth it to experience the discomfort of speaking up? Because after they speak up, they feel that they're valued, their voice is valued, that the speaking up was worth it because it led to some sort of positive outcome, not them being ignored, not them being punished, or nothing changing. So that's, I think, an interesting distinction in this conversation as well.
So I love that. And it's actually making me think like, I always think about my team and just as organizational cultures evolve, like how much is put on managers to create like the to have an impact on how their team feels, right? Which makes complete sense to me. What I
Hmm.
think about is like I love the distinction you made around the comfort. And I do think that there's probably like you said, like, do I feel safe and is it worth it? I always think about with my team, like, okay, like, am I overdoing it? Am I trying to ask them like, hey, okay, do you have any feedback? Do you have something to tell me? I try to be very vulnerable, very personal. Maybe sometimes I overdo it a little bit. I don't know, I'm trying to find that balance. But I
Hmm.
think I love what you're saying because I found myself in those situations personally often. And I've had at this point in my career many different leaders. And some of them I felt pretty comfortable with, some of them I didn't. But in the end, when you have to tell somebody something that's tough, I guess even if you're really comfortable with someone,
Mm.
it's likely that there's going to be some level of discomfort, right? Like I'm even thinking like telling my family or telling somebody like in the true sense of feedback, it's usually something that's not like, oh my God, you're amazing. I love you're doing the best. It's like, you're amazing. I love you're doing great. I would love for you to do X. And very
Hmm.
rarely is that first reaction like, oh, cool. It's like a little bit like, and then it's, people are generally appreciative of it. But I love that component that you were saying that what's worth it, almost no matter what situation you're in, is going to still be hard and how much organizations can educate their people around that too. That like don't wait for that full comfort. Don't feel wait to feel like your leader's your best friend and then you can speak
Yeah.
up, that it's still worth it.
Yeah, so I would even challenge I wonder if comfort is the right word, because if you look at the definition of psychological safety as Edmonton says it, the definition of psychological safety is that we feel that it is worth taking interpersonal risk, or an environment in which it feels safe to take interpersonal risk. And so I think one of the misnomers with or the myths around psychological safety or a speak up culture is that there is comfort. I don't know if there is. I think that there's actually discomfort, but it feels that that discomfort is worth digging into. When you have feedback for someone, it's this notion that, Sanja, I care about you so much that I'd be remiss if I didn't. Now we get into the Kim Scott radical candor work of care personally and challenge directly.
Yeah.
So I would actually say it's, a speak up culture is about embracing discomfort, because on
Mhm.
the other end of discomfort is growth, is a positive outcome, is some sort of improvement.
Yeah. So as an organization,
Hmm.
how do you know? How do you know if you have it? How do you know if you're doing okay with it? How do you know, like, and these are all big questions, so we can, take them down a little bit, but I'm trying to think like we have different we have listeners or attendees on our webinar who are in different kinds of positions. So we'll have probably
Hmm.
somebody that's, head of HR, maybe CEO of a company. We'll have somebody that's a leader. We'll have somebody who's an individual contributor, but they're all here because they value this topic. And so let's say, maybe if we take a persona of I'm somebody who's in HR or I'm a CEO, and I'm seeing a lot of things where, like, goodness, I want to make sure we're not an organization where people are not bringing challenges up because we're realizing more and more how detrimental can be, and that it's not a nice to do. It's actually like kind of a must do for business. But
Hmm.
how do I know it's not a blind spot for me? Like if I'm sitting here on this call being like, oh, I joined your conversation because I think it's valuable. Clearly, I care about it, and that's why I'm here. But I think we're doing okay. Like, how do
Hmm.
people really know they're doing okay and it's not a blind spot?
Yeah, well, and this is where data is so valuable. So, I mean, know that your opinion, regardless of where you are in an organization, is but one data point. And the value of data is when you have a more holistic view of what the general feeling is, not just by one, but by many. And so I'm generally unimpressed when a senior leader goes, "Oh yeah, speak up culture. We have that." My question is, how do you know?
Hmm.
And I think you can know by two things. One is the valuable data that you can get through surveys that you and other firms can do, which is brilliant. But it's also a true mark of psychological safety in a speak up culture is, do we debate? Do we disagree well? With respect and tact. But it's also, it's so interesting to say that when there is a speak up culture, we actually don't always agree about everything. That
Yeah.
can be groupthink. So I think it's these two things of one, can there be meaningful data through surveys, and that it isn't just necessarily once a year, but micro surveys, multiple moments throughout an annual cycle, as well as what is the general feeling from yourself and many others, getting as many data points as you can. I like to sort of make this joke of, Sonia, I have two young kids. I have an 8 and a 5-year-old, and I care that they feel a part of our family. I care that they feel that they have voice and that they belong, and that yes, they know who's in charge. My wife and I, we lead this little organization, but I want my children to feel that their voice is still of value. Now, I could send them an email and say, "Dear children, please click on this link and fill out the survey." But if I do nothing about the survey and if I don't have a conversation with them, the survey doesn't lift as much value as if I do something with it.
Yeah.
If I take the survey and then go to their bedroom and have the conversation, or take them out for ice cream, or have a one-on-one meeting, to your point, and share the same thing, but actually see that there's some changes in what we do around here that
Yeah.
includes them, then there's value. So my favorite survey question in any survey, any culture survey ever, is how likely do you feel that any change will occur after a result of taking this survey? And if
Oh.
those numbers are low, you've got cultural issues. That it's not only about measurement, it's about doing something with that data to drive actual real change in behavior and action in systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you were saying about groupthink and agreement. And I know, and it's funny because I just said, oh, I love what you're saying. So I think that there is, so like, yes, plus one. But
Yes.
there is so much value in disagreement. And I think there's sometimes those words, like just as I said disagreement, I was like, oh, that sounds ugly, in different
Hmm.
perspectives. And I think a lot of that is maybe how you frame it, right? So it's not, oh, let's bring disagreement to the table. And then, if you have an a-hole or a few of them on your team, they're like, wow, watch me go. But it's more that, hey, all of us have different opinions. All of us, or many of us might be viewing these things differently. And the more we know, the better off we're going to be, because that's just how the world is. Like there is no flippant way that everybody in this world has the same opinion about any single thing. Like nothing. Like
Yeah.
you can probably not come up like, I mean, the sun is probably not yellow to earth. It's not like there's a million things. And so how you structure that. So for example, if somebody, let's go down to like a team level. So if somebody is on this webinar and they're like, listen, like I have team meetings and I love this is actually an interesting one for me too, because I told you I love my team and we talk a lot and we're in different places. So a lot of our meetings are virtual. And depending on, is it a check-in meeting? Are we going through a list? Are we having a discussion? And you've met my team, they're awesome people. Sometimes they're very quiet. I'm like, is this thing on? Can you hear? Like, did my Wi-Fi go down?
Mm.
Like, come on, jump in. So, what would be in this? Like, I'm thinking, I'm asking for your advice because
Hmm.
I'm also coming to you saying, like, I have an amazing team. Like, and I think we have really good dynamics. And I still think that there's an opportunity maybe for people to feel more comfortable because as much as I'm sure they adore me, maybe on good days, there's no way they agree with me on everything. Like, because
Yeah.
sometimes I look back and I'm like, what did I say? What did I do? That was like, that didn't make any sense. So I'm sure one of them thought about that before I did. Um, so anyways, to summarize, for leaders, team managers who are on this team that are saying, hey, I'm in, how would you recommend that I maybe approach things differently? Like, let's say I have a team meeting later today, or I have one tomorrow, or there's something like really important that we need to discuss, and I feel like there's got to be more ideas in the team that people are letting me on. What are some practical things that I can do to get people to open up and really have that like very healthy like sharing of different ideas and maybe debate in that?
Yeah.
Sorry, I asked you
Beautiful.
like 75 questions. You
No,
got
that's great.
it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And just so you know, Sonia, my display is frozen, so I can no longer share my screen. So if there's a
Oh,
certain
let me
slide or
know if
something
there's,
you
and you let
think,
me know too if there's a slide you want me to share. I got you
cool.
here.
Okay, cool. So a couple things here. So one is, I mean, the value of a speak up culture is the diversity of opinion, that when you have more diverse points of view, you can get to a higher common truth. You can meaningfully debate about a strategy or the way you view something or the perspective of the customer. Like that's the value of having a speak up culture and hearing the voice of many and the voice of more. There's one slide you might be able to put up called the speak up culture spectrum. So this is what speaking up is and what speaking up is not. So a speak up culture is a culture, not an instruction. I can't say speak up as a demand and expect anything to happen. I must create the environment where the majority of folks feel that it's safe and worth it to. Not necessarily comfortable, but worth that risk and that there's enough psychological safety. But what speak up culture is and isn't. So what speak up culture is it ought to include respect, tact, decency, emotional intelligence, situational awareness, right? A speak up culture is not talking about all the things all the time with all the people. That could be oversharing.
Yeah.
And so on the spectrum of a speak up is not sucking up or hogging air. That is, oh, boss says speak up, so I'll just speak up all the time. No, the feedback to that individual is actually zip it and create space, build others up. You're speaking up not to add, you're speaking up to be seen. Limit it. On the other side, a speak up culture is not a hall pass to be a jerk or a hall pass to be an a-hole, right? Well, I'm just bringing my authentic self to work is not an excuse to degrade or
Yeah.
knock others down, right? And sometimes you might have an experience where someone is being a jerk or being an a-hole and sharing truth, but isn't aware of it. And in that
Mhm.
instance, we still ought to reward the intent, but provide feedback on and coaching on the behavior and the impact of that behavior, right? So then the other thing to answer your question head on of like, I think I have a great team. We have a dynamic team. We get along, and yet I still want to hear their voice more, and I'm not. So then now are what are all the ways that I can both encourage and reward folks for
Mhm.
speaking up? Encourage means your voice matters. I want to hear it. Encourage means silence. Encourage means ask open-ended questions. Encourage also means vary the ways that you hear from folks. Utilize chat, send a survey to your own team or some sort of poll or get data, not just in the speak in this meeting now. We must vary how we get voice because voice can show up in one-on-one meetings, it can show up in group meetings, it can show up in loud or in larger town halls, but it can also show up in written communication. So what are the varied ways that you're gaining and getting input? And if you truly want to hear your people's voice, ask an open-ended question and zip it or put your team
Mhm.
into a breakout room, right? And then come back. All right, what did you discuss? because I know you didn't discuss nothing unless you all just went to get coffee. So it's encourage folks in a myriad and very different ways, and then reward folks when they do speak up. Because if you do speak up and you aren't rewarded, it means you're either being ignored or worse, punished.
Yeah.
Reward doesn't necessarily mean a pay raise, a bonus, a job promotion, or a statue made in one's honor out in front of corporate headquarters or, in the cloud. Because let's face it, a lot of us work hybrid and remote now. Reward means more intrinsic. Thank you, Sanja. Wow, that must have taken courage to share. I really appreciate what you're sharing. Can you share more about this perspective? I don't yet understand everything that you're sharing. Share more. We didn't implement your idea, but here's why. These are all forms of encouraging and then rewarding folks when they use their voice. So that's what I would say.
Oh, Shed, I love that. And I think there's so much to unpack there. So I'll reiterate just a few points. I think and few that resonate with me. So I'm sure for you listeners, like take it all in and have your own notes, maybe re-listen, because again, like this is an area that Chad and I have talked about quite a few times. And I feel like every time we talk, there's something else that really jumps out at me. So one that kind of like stood out and I was like, why did I not think of this before? So at Question Pro, our CEO, I've known him for probably 20 years. I adore him. You know, Viv, you would probably say like Viv and I are pretty different people, like
Hmm.
different style, right? And one thing that Viv does is he prefers written form of communication. Like he is huge into transparency, he's huge into sharing, and he will take like hours and write a really long email any day over hopping and talking and doing like whatever on a town hall or on a management meeting. Like he prefers things written down, and to me I appreciate that because I'm like, oh, I'd talk any day because for me it's faster, I feel like I can add my energy. But clearly, just in a sample size of two, we have very different preferences. And so
Hmm.
one thing that I think about, even just my own reflection and with the team, is a lot of times like we ask people to brainstorm and talk, and we ask them to talk in a meeting, and whether it's a bigger meeting or a smaller meeting, generally that idea generation is in verbal form. And maybe more often than not, it's kind of on the spot. Like, right, we get in a meeting, we're like, hey, we're going to brainstorm X, everybody like grab your coffee. But very rarely, as much as it's maybe a best practice, is like, do you send somebody an agenda a couple weeks ahead of time and they prepare? And so maybe there's some people that prefer to take time to think versus rattle things off the top of their head.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people that prefer to share that in written form. And I would say, like, for me, rarely do I finish a meeting and I'm like, okay, well, I'll say, like, oh, okay, send me a note, but people are probably like, yeah, sure, lady, I'll slack you. Like, it's not, I feel like I could commit to it more. Like, hey, we're going to have this meeting, we're going to discuss this, or send me any of your ideas ahead of time with it. Like, there's different ways that I can build that in. But I haven't, even with my best intentions, like we chat and then we high five and I open up like, yeah, you know where to find me anytime. And great, good for me. But people don't. And then I just recently went to India and I sat down with my team one on one with everybody.
Hmm.
And I've told this story before, but I love it. Like our head of engineering is like, oh, how did like you sat down one on one with a bunch of engineers for like 45 minutes to an hour each? Like, how was that? I'm like, he's like, did they say much? I'm like, we ran over. Like nearly every meeting ran over. And so, but it was one on one. They knew I was coming. Like I scheduled this so if they needed to emotionally prepare that I was going to be there with all my energy and all my hugs, they could. And it was really productive. But it's different. It's kind of finding that groove and knowing that not everybody is the same, but giving them the opportunity to show up and speak up in the
Yeah.
way that's more it's most natural to them. So I thought like I just really wanted to emphasize that point because I think that's huge. And I would say that if I, as somebody who studies this as an organizational psychologist, as somebody who cares for her team, totally had this oversight that if my friend you're listening this and you're like me too, you're not alone.
Yeah, yeah. But I think what's wonderful, Sonia, is you're pointing to a couple things. So one is the value of the platinum rule over the golden rule, which is for everyone. And then as well, what's the value of a plan? So I want to talk about two of those things.
Mm.
So I'll start in the reverse order. So the value of a plan is not necessarily sticking to it to a T, but the
Yeah.
value of a plan is planning, is going through the intentional process of how do we want this to go? How do we figure this can go?
Mhm.
Sharing it with whoever it is appropriate. But then what is it? What's the Mike Tyson quote that you can throw your plan out the door once you get punched in the face? Like the value of the plan isn't necessarily following it, but having it such that when you need to deviate or flex from it, you can, right? And you can seamlessly improvise when you tirelessly prepare. So I think the value of planning is to have the plan, but not to follow it when it becomes very clear that you should no longer, right?
Yeah.
So that's one piece. The other is, I appreciate that you shared these distinctions in your preferences between, you would rather meet and talk live versus a Viv would rather write out an email. And both of those are valuable. And those of us who wish to lead in any relationship. That's why I actually don't like to call them individual contributors. I like to call us individual leaders,
Mm.
leaders of teams, and leaders of leaders. Because even if you're, quote, an individual contributor, you're
Mm.
still leading yourself, you're
Yeah.
still leading in other relationships, and you're still leading your work. So I think everyone can be a lowercase l leader without a title, should we behave as a leader. And those of us who wish to behave as a leader, I think, practice that platinum rule.
Yeah.
So the golden rule is what I'm teaching my 5-year-old right now. Treat others the way you wish to be treated. It's basic respect and common decency, right? But for you and I, the golden rule is a little bit outdated because we need to flex, right? The platinum rule is treat others the way they wish to be treated. So just so that you know your preferences, you have to actually look at, well, what are the preferences of the people around me? Right.
Yeah.
And if the preferences of the people around me don't match my own, how can I do the work to flex so that I can meet them too and not just meet me? Right. I think that's a big work of leadership is, and for on both ends, flexing our styles so we can best communicate, resonate, connect with one another across the varied ways of how we can communicate.
Yeah, and a big part of that is just remembering to ask that too. And we were talking about surveys, and I'm like, again, like I'm the queen of surveys. It's what I do for a living. And I missed asking that from my team. Like, hey, here's some
Mm,
things I'd love for us to focus on in the next quarter and accomplish together. What do you think is the best way for you to contribute? And I
nice.
am sensitive to some things like time zones or different, like I literally have people all over the place. And so finding a time for a team meeting is a killer, but people are good and they're troopers. But I've asked, and people have asked me like, oh, can we have this a couple hours later? I'm like, no, because it's gonna be like 10 o'clock, for half of our teammates. Oh, you're right. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry. And so but again, it's asking and it's having that conversation. And the other
Yeah.
point that I really wanted to highlight that you were saying, and again, I think maybe a lot of people know, but we miss it often in everyday practice, is that recognition and acknowledgement, and in many different ways. And
Yeah.
so we saw the data right earlier that said that like half of people don't, or not half, like a quarter of people feel heard when they actually,
And
share
valued.
their
Yeah.
opinions and valued.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times, we know there is no way we can implement every idea. There's no way, even if they're good. Like it's humanly impossible to manage that change and put everything in. Like, I'm not even saying like if an idea was bad or not sure. Like you hear a lot of things and you're like, okay, what do we have resources for? What can we do? What can have the greatest impact? Like you just have to pick your battles. I think that there is an opportunity to better close that loop and better have that conversation around, hey, like we chose this. This is the reason we chose it. Thank you so much for bringing this up. This is what we learned from you. And I think a lot of that is even like the, true of one feedback. And I think that's probably where I've had more conversations. If somebody, let's say, you and I have a conversation and say, hey, Shed, like, what do you think I could be doing better? What do you think I could be doing better here? And you share some of your advice. I'm like, oh, that's really good. Listen, I'm going to totally take this to heart. I think this is really meaningful. I can't do it today because of this, this, and this. But you know what? I'm going to sit on it. I'm going to see if I can prioritize that in a few months. But like, wow, thank you for bringing that up because I actually had no idea that I could be
Mm.
doing this, or I had no idea the way I was communicating was coming across a certain way. So that's more in that like individual development, leadership feedback that I feel like I've heard that, and there's still an opportunity to do it better. But I think when it comes to ideas, there's probably an even better, bigger opportunity to do it. Because how
Hmm.
often, and again, like we don't not do it because we're bad people or we don't care. Oftentimes we don't do it because we're running so fast and you have this meeting, and I'm thinking like, if you're in person, you got your whiteboards and like you're, writing things out, maybe you're posting things on the walls. And then after you're like, okay, cool, maybe we're gonna do this. And then you're like, okay, well, my idea didn't get picked, but why? Like, are we gonna do a retrospective meeting after? So I just really wanted to highlight that because that one, recognition of a contribution, and then two, the conversation around why certain things got picked and why some didn't at the time. I think
Hmm.
we don't realize how valuable those are and how much they can reinforce the behaviors we want in the future because people don't feel shut out. They don't feel like they're not valuable. They get it. Like it's just life. So anyways, I'll stop rambling
Yeah.
about that one, but it really, really, as you were talking, that really resonated with me.
Well, but this is a form of reward, which is to circle back with someone and say, hey, your idea was great and we didn't implement it for this reason that might be outside of our control, but it was still a great idea. Like, keep it coming.
Yeah.
That's a way in which, you can acknowledge frustration, but yet say, the validity of your idea was beautiful, but just for this reason, whether it's resource, budget, timing, whatever, we couldn't do it. But like, please keep it coming because we need to embrace it. Now, if every time that person comes up with an idea, it isn't implemented, that might affect their engagement.
Yeah.
But at least you're acknowledging and saying, do more of this, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, a few more things came up. One, when you were talking about polling your team on having some time zone empathy and what's the appropriate time, right? So I think a couple of things. I mean, one, how can you go on rotation? Like, if I as leader always pick a time then that's convenient for me, what's up with that? Like, I think we should go on tour and there's a Buenos Aires meeting, then there's an India meeting, even if we're doing it virtually. Even more so, how can we actually travel to folks? Like, if the standard is you only come to corporate headquarters, but we don't go out to you, what standard does that set?
Yeah.
I have a great friend and a client who worked in architecture out of Dubai. And though they were peers with another team in India, there was sort of this subservient relationship that the folks in India didn't view themselves as equal to the team in Dubai. And so my friend who was leading the team in Dubai said the next meeting we're traveling to India to show that there is this equality, that we are
Yeah.
standing on equal footing. That symbolic gesture is huge.
Yeah.
Um, the if a couple other things that came up as you were sharing, Sanja. So one is the impact of pressure, whether it's time, financial, any internal or external pressure on our integrity and ethics is real, right? Or even on our performance or ability to have patience and calm and stop and listen. So that time pressure is a big deal. So what are we doing to ensure that it doesn't get the best of us? What are sort of the the processes that we're designing to ensure that we have time to pause and get folks' opinions before we keep going and potentially make a mistake or miss out on an
Yeah.
opportunity. And then, yeah, I have some other thoughts on what makes good feedback and effective feedback, because we were talking about feedback as well, but I'll pause and see what other
Bring
comments
it,
you
bring it.
see. Okay,
I love that too because I think having hard conversations is hard.
of
Like,
course,
that
of
that sounded really
course.
funny, but it's so valuable. And I think many of us still shy away from it because it is uncomfortable, because it is challenging, because oftentimes, like, you are telling somebody something you know is good for them, but is going to be hard for them to hear. And so it's like you have this, like, pulling forces where it's usually when it's worth it to say it, it's because you really care about someone that you're willing to make yourself uncomfortable. And
Hmm.
sometimes it depends on the kind of feedback. It's directly related to the relationship. Other times it's also to really help that person in general in their life. So maybe
Yeah.
somebody is doing something and it's bothering me a little bit, but I can deal with it. But I know I'm
Hmm.
like, oh, if they just change this one thing, like things will be so much easier for them. And I know they mean well, but the way they communicate X, I know other people don't get it. So maybe spend a little bit of time on that, and then I'll come back. I have one thought around what you were saying. If somebody keeps saying, giving ideas and they're never taken, like what happens there? But let's do
Yeah.
feedback first because I think it's so critical for speak up culture. And I think it's just so critical for everything in both of our personal and professional lives.
Awesome. And yeah, I do have a slide on this if you want to put up. There's a
Oh,
slide called FBI, Feedback Behavior Impact.
all
Um, yeah, so a couple things. So one is uh yeah, I mean, feedback can be from the perspective of you want to see someone grow. Feedback could also be in the perspective that the way someone is showing up or performing is actually bringing the team down. So it could be both for their personal growth and development, but also it's having a real impact on the team and the business. And so there could be a larger sort of macro perspective for this as well. Oftentimes we feel like, ooh, I don't want to hurt their feelings, but it's also I don't want to go through that hard work myself, you know? But so there is a formula that I love for feedback that I write about in the book, and we have this resource on our website as well at Shed Inspires, called FBI, Feeling Behavior Impact. And I love this formula because it can transform feedback, both positive and constructive, by from being one word or a line triggering and potentially shallow to deep and meaningful. It can actually drive some behavior change. So FBI stands for feeling, behavior, and impact. So I feel when you, right, or when this happened, real behavior, and the impact is. So it's both for positive as well as constructive. So I could say, hey, Sanja, Guille, team, great job today. That's meaningless feedback because there's nothing you can do with great job. You don't know how you earned it, and you
yeah,
don't know what you can do again in your behavior to repeat said great accolade of great job. Or I could say, I feel totally engaged and bought in with the preparation that we've done, with the podcast that we did, with all that we're doing to partner together, and the impact is I'm in. I'm so in. I'm delighted to see what more we can do together. That's way better than great job,
yeah.
right? Now, on the other end, constructive, you could say to me, "Hey Shed, you're lazy." And I'd be like, "What?" Right? Triggered, back up.
Ah,
Or you could say, "Hey Shed, I feel let down when you behavior were late to 3 meetings last week, and the impact is I'm not sure we can trust you with what's on your plate right now." And then usually for a constructive, there's a bonus, which is an open-ended question. This isn't like you. What's up? What's going
yeah,
on? Right. And I think we need to know, especially as we become more senior in an organization, that our feedback, though it should be based upon factual events and behavior, feedback is not indeed fact, it's opinion. And the
yeah,
purpose of feedback is to start dialogue, to say, this is my experience, but I make up a story that you don't wake up in the morning and say, how can I disappoint my boss today? What's up? And what am I doing? Right.
yeah.
I had a boss previously that the only time the F word feedback was mentioned when I had done something wrong and they were about to chew me out and tell me what I
Oh,
did wrong with no sort of leeway for like, can I share my version of the experience and what might be going on in our relationship or something larger within the organization that's causing me to behave that way? Or do you want to just keep punishing me and knocking me down? Right. So FBI is a great tool. And this notion for leaders to know that they aren't right. They simply have an experience and an opinion, and other folks on the team have an experience and an opinion as well.
yeah. I love that. I'm gonna keep this because I think again, sharing feedback, sharing it's I think if you have a formula, and this is a simple but powerful formula, it helps you prepare for that tough conversation, right? Because then you know, like I'm hitting the right things, like I'm sharing in a constructive way. And it's like a very brief checklist, but a very meaningful checklist because you're right. There's some things that again, maybe we don't realize if you say like, "Hey, I'm really disappointed." Well, why? What did I do? Or like, "Hey, you're being
Yeah.
lazy." Like, "Oh my goodness, like what, what in the world have I done to make you feel that way? Like how can I fix this?" And I think you're right too. I think positive reinforcement is sometimes easier, and sometimes if someone's like, "You did amazing," I'm like, "Woo!" And I'm like, I'll go because I'm like, oh, I feel good. And like, oh, maybe later I'll wonder, like, oh, what was it? And it's helpful because again, to reinforce, like if we high five after this webinar, okay, like what went well? What could we do better?
Yeah.
Um, so the positive example is really powerful. In the more constructive one, it's almost really necessary because it's even more likely to elicit negative feelings and more resistance. And so that to kind of think through that, I think is really important. And
Yeah.
um quickly going back to one, and then I know I can't, like I'm looking at the time, I can't an hour's almost, so we'll start to wrap up in a minute, but we're in a few minutes. But I wanted to ask you for your opinion about one thing that you mentioned. So
hmm
somebody repeatedly bringing up ideas and them not really hitting home, and that person, maybe rightfully so, being like, okay, when you were saying that, one thing popped into my mind, and maybe it's right, maybe it's not, but I'm thinking, is that maybe like a learning opportunity? So if somebody cares enough that they're
hmm
sharing, is there something that they need to know better about the business? Or is there something they need to be more clear about? Is there a common thread where you're like, I really don't want to lose the value of this person bringing up ideas and actually setting a great example for the team. But I think if I just educate them on X or Y so they can think about things differently,
hmm
maybe then like we're gonna start to see a shift. Like, and I don't know if that's maybe like a naive way of thinking it, if it's accurate, but I was
Yeah.
just thinking, like, what are some opportunities if somebody has that situation that they could change things around instead of that person just feeling like, you know what, forget it. Like clearly I'm not valuable.
Yeah.
Trying.
I I think it's two things. So one is you never want to dim someone's light, right? So if someone's strength is like they come up with these brilliant, innovative ideas, but yet we shouldn't punish them because the system or the construct or whatever's going on in the business can allow for that. So I think there's two things. I think one is how can we still educate and share and do what we can to help someone thrive within a system that may not support some of the innovative ideas that they have. The other is how can you kind of hackathon it? How can you say, okay, you keep coming up with these brilliant things and we can't execute on it for these reasons. Let's actually give you something where you can flex this muscle and do it and make something happen in a real material, awesome way and sort of give them a little, like not little, but something that they can actually influence and change. So you can
Yeah.
actually brighten that light as opposed to continue to knock it down. If for some reason someone continues to bring all these great ideas and it just isn't working and it isn't happening, I'm a big believer of if you get to a point where you realize that someone on your team could thrive better elsewhere, whether that's as an entrepreneur in a different part of the business where they can be more entrepreneurial,
Yeah.
or another organization, I still think it's of service and creates loyalty. That if you realize, wow, someone could actually thrive and do more off my team, that still creates loyalty and they'll refer people to come work on your team still.
Yeah.
So I think it's both yes, an education, but also what's a positive, healthy, impactful outlet.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, those are some thoughts that I have there, Sonia.
Oh, that's great. Because that, I think to me, it's such a huge opportunity both for the person and for the organization. Because again, we saw the stats, so few people feel like they can speak up. And so if you're one of those individuals who does, how can you rechannel that? Because I think it has a domino effect. I think it's doesn't only, it of course impacts the person, but likely not only the person, because if I'm timid and I'm not sure if I want to bring my ideas forth, or and then I see like Mary, continually doing it and nothing, like nope, oh,
hmm
it's like, oh man, like Mary's super outgoing and she's really likable and she, keeps putting things out. Like I don't want to put myself in that spot. I don't want to be vulnerable, put myself out there to have the same happen. Maybe it's just better if I don't. So sometimes I think it's, we need to think about the impact on all those others who are not being vocal. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes that's a lot bigger even than like the one person that it's actually happening with.
Yeah. And then again, you as a leader, what's the condition you're creating to hear from a myriad different of voices? And one of my favorite things that I did with a colleague of mine who still remains to be a very dear friend, I'm extroverted. I often speak to think. I'm comfortable, similar with you, Sanja, of like, I don't need the meeting prep. Let's just hop on and have the conversation. Now, sometimes the conversation can go better with some prep. But I'm thinking of a colleague of mine who is far more introverted. He thinks and then speaks. And every time he would contribute in a meeting, it would always make the meeting and the conversation and the perspective better, richer, different, right? And so I designed a rule with him, which is if we hit two-thirds the way through a meeting and we haven't heard his voice yet, I had green light permission to go, David, we haven't heard your point of view yet. Where are you at in this conversation and what are you thinking? And even though he was silent, he was always thinking, and he'd bring, I don't know if this is relevant, or I have this idea, and it would always fundamentally change and add to the conversation. Or if he was like, nah, I got nothing right now. I'm tracking and this is good, right? But
Yeah.
I made sure that I designed something that we would hear his voice, because it wasn't his natural propensity to voice, but he typically
Yeah.
9 times out of 10 added something that would just make it better.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I think that's a brilliant idea. So I'm looking at the time. We have just a few minutes left. I'm going to pop up a screen with your contact information, my contact information, scan for your website, all of that good stuff. And for those of you on with us today, just a reminder that we're going to have a drawing for a signed copy of Shed's book. So keep an eye out for a note from me or my colleague Guy in the coming days. But Shed, as we start to wrap up, any parting thoughts, advice, anything that we didn't? I feel like, oh, we talked about so much today, and I know that there's just an infinite amount of things to talk about on this topic. Is there anything that you want to leave our audience with, maybe that we didn't hit on in our conversation today?
I'm just such a believer. I think a through line in this conversation, Sonia, is that relationship is the foundation of what we can accomplish. The reason I love this work so much is that when we develop deeper relationship with ourselves, that's called self-awareness, when we have better and deeper relationship with the people around us and the world around us, we can accomplish more. And so I think developing a speak up culture, leaders realizing that their behavior bears weight, that as a leader, whether a capital L in title or lowercase l in your behavior, as a leader, you have influence. Your whisper is a shout and your tiptoes are stomps. And so those are sort of the through lines that come here, that the behaviors of leaders matter. And if we cultivate it and strive to build deeper and better relationship with folks around us, it's just better for business.
I love that. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Shed, for your time today. Again, here's Shed's contact information, my contact information for any of you that want to continue the conversation, that want to learn more about Shed and his work. If you're curious about measuring your speak up culture in your organization through surveys, Shed and I can help you with that as well. Please don't hesitate to reach out. And again, I know we covered a lot of different topics during our time today. I know there's a lot more to talk about in this area. So, in the spirit of speaking up, for any of you who are on there, give us a call, send us a note, link to us on LinkedIn, whatever your preferred method of communication is. But if you have any feedback for us, if you have any recommendations, if you have a situation you'd like to talk through, again, I think all of us, like Shed mentioned, relationships are the one that are really going to make a difference. And so both he and I are huge believers in getting to know, others, understanding each other better. We're always learning from each other. So please don't hesitate to reach out and continue the conversation outside of the webinar. Shed, again, a million thank yous. I feel you're so brilliant. I love the work that you do. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for the way that you show up and bring it into the world. And thank you for sharing your time with us and our audience today.
Thank you so much. Hope to see you all again soon.